Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Moya Lothian-McLean, and I'm joined tonight by Rivkah Brown. Coming up later tonight, we're going to take a look at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to US Congress last night, and then President Biden addressing the American people today. There's shocking footage that has emerged of a police officer violently assaulting a man at Manchester Airport, and Wales has another new First Minister incoming. Stay tuned for all of that. But first, we've got big news coming in on the UK government's relations to Israel. The Labour government is on the brink of making two highly significant changes to its policy on Israel. Foreign Secretary David Lammy is set to halt arms exports to Israel. He's also poised to withdraw the UK's objections to International Criminal Court prosecutors' application for arrest warrants for Israeli officials. Those officials are, of course, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. The story comes from sources with knowledge of the matter, who spoke to Novara media under condition of anonymity. But there could still be a potential spanner in the works, Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Both decisions require his assent, and it remains unclear whether he'll be prepared to break with US strategy. Novara media understands that David Lammy intends to publish the government's legal advice on arms sales, with Rivkah Brown reporting this. The advice, which is expected as early as next week, is likely to say that Israel has violated international humanitarian law in its assault on Gaza and suggests that the UK should take additional measures to ensure its weapons are not being used in such violations. It will likely recommend that the UK restricts some, if not all, weapons exports to Israel. Novara media understands that the Attorney General, Foreign Secretary, and FCDO officials are minded to follow that advice. The decision comes in the context of mass protests against Israel's assault on Gaza, which has so far officially killed nearly 40,000 Palestinians. The real toll may be much higher. There have also been legal challenges to the continued sale of arms to Israel, most notably by the Global Legal Action Network and Palestinian human rights organisation Al-Haq. That case will have its first court hearing in early October. And civil servants have objected to the arms trade with Israel too. In April, members of the Public and Commercial Services Union, working in the Department of Business and Trade, expressed their desire to stop working on Israeli arms export licenses. That protest may have been on good grounds, as some civil servants fear that the publication of the UK government's legal advice could lead to repercussions for them. A legal expert under the condition of anonymity told Novara media that civil servants may fear that publishing their advice could expose them to prosecution both in the UK and at The Hague. That's because if their advice indicates their belief that Israel is breaching international law, but does not conclude that the UK must halt arms sales, they may be interpreted as enabling war crimes. Other officials are more confident that the civil service's way of doing business will be protective, telling Novara this. Us civil servants are very good at asking the minister a certain question to get a particular answer from lawyers, not asking the fuller question that might give an answer ministers don't like. This type of politicisation of the civil service only serves to erode trust in society. I'd highly doubt a civil servant would ask, because they don't want the answer, is Israel committing war crimes? Novara media also understands that the UK government will no longer pursue its objection to the ICC prosecutors' cases against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. In April, ICC prosecutor Cameron Khan applied to the court for arrest warrants against the top Israeli ministers. States that signatories to the ICC can object to such applications. The UK government, under the Tories, lodged an immediate objection. The new Labour government initially indicated it would drop the objection. However, under reported pressure from the US, which is not a signatory to the ICC, too many presidents getting locked up, the Labour government U-turned and agreed to press ahead with the objection, according to an Israeli newspaper. But things now seem to have changed again, with Novara media reporting this. Foreign Secretary David Lammy, Attorney General Richard Hermer KC, and officials within the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office are in agreement that the UK should drop its objections to the ICC. If it does, it would mark a major break from the line of the United States that the UK has mostly followed in relation to Israel and Palestine in recent years. Tomorrow is the ICC's deadline for lodging any objections, but the UK is now not expected to submit anything. Rivkah, this is your report. pretty bombastic. Walk us through how significant this will be if it comes off, and is it likely to come off?
Well, if it does come off, it will be hugely significant. The UK has very rarely restricted or banned arms sales to Israel. I mean, the last time it did sort of wholesale bans was now decades ago. Although David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, did suspend some arms licenses in 2014. It would be major, and it would be major, probably more diplomatically and sort of symbolically than operationally, because in practice, Israel doesn't rely hugely on British weapons exports or imports. And it also, Britain has already made clear, and David Lammy has been quite categorical, even as Shadow Foreign Secretary, that he won't contemplate a blanket ban on arms. What he's said is he would consider a ban on offensive weapons as opposed to defensive weapons. But in fact, and as someone who spoke to me for my reports sort of pointed out, Yasmin Ahmed, who's the director of the UK branch of Human Rights Watch, there is no such distinction between offensive and defensive weapons under both domestic and international humanitarian law. So operationally, Lammy will probably try and kind of weasel his way out of actually suspending that many licenses. But what will be much more important is the fact that the UK is going to take a stand by publicly and quite kind of noisily, potentially, restricting these licenses and publishing the advice rather than kind of quietly doing it. You know, this has happened in the past where the UK has attempted to quietly restrict arms sales to Israel. Tony Blair did it, Gordon Brown did it. And in both cases, it came out either through leaks to the press or, I think in the case of Gordon Brown, through an Israeli official source saying, well, we've got fewer licenses than we did a few months ago. So it's actually really meaningful that it seems like Lammy and the Foreign Office are gearing up to make actually quite a big song and dance about restricting arms to Israel. But how many arms will actually end up not going probably won't be that material. On the ICC, I think this is also hugely symbolic. We heard only a couple of weeks ago that the UK was getting sat on quite heavily by Biden and by US officials to press ahead with objecting to the prosecutor issuing arrest warrants. And so kind of isolating the US and the UK in their sort of outspoken support for Israel and pushing back against the ICC. So if the UK does go ahead and drop its objections, which we'll know by tomorrow, by the way, because they're due tomorrow at midnight, I believe. So this is, gonna have to, it's kind of a binary thing that we'll know by the end of tomorrow. If it doesn't submit any objections, if it pulls its kind of sort of intention to object, then it's carving a very different path to the one that the US is, or at least the one that Biden is. We can talk more about Kamala Harris later in the show. But I think, it is possibly quite a lot of political pageantry and symbolism rather than, how many lives it's actually going to save in Gaza is kind of to be seen. But I do think that the dominoes are starting to fall a little bit for Israel. And not to say that the tail wags the dog and that the UK's actions will push the US, but I do feel like a kind of a consensus is starting to arise among Western states, not just the UK, but Canada, which has blocked arms sales very recently to Israel, Italy, Finland, in part, Spain, all have partially or totally suspended arms sales to Israel. And that consensus, the UK joining in that consensus, will give it momentum, I think, towards kind of towards Israel becoming more and more of a pariah state to whom exports are just not seen as kind of internationally admissible, I suppose. So I think it's more about diplomacy than it is about operations. Israel's still got a ton of weapons, and I can guarantee will still be conducting, the next flower massacre in the coming days and weeks. But whether or not this slows it down and kind of takes the kind of wind out of its sails somewhat, I think is much more likely. I think on the question of whether or not Lammy is likely to kind of go through with it, hard to say. I mean, I think ultimately what we do know is that Lammy, Rich Hermer, who we can talk about, and the FCDO, the Foreign Office officials, they're all in agreement. So if this doesn't go according to the kind of reporting that I've done, then we know who's responsible, and it's Keir Starmer.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about Richard Hermer, because when Labour came to power, Emily Thornberry was expected to be the new Attorney General, but she was replaced by Richard Hermer. She was not happy about this at all. Who is he? Has he played a big role in this potentially massive change in policy? Because it is, again, another U-turn from what we expected from this Labour government.
It is, I suppose. I mean, we have to bear in mind that David Lammy, as Shadow Foreign Secretary, was pushing for Cameron to publish the advice on Israel and Gaza. So he was kind of like laying the groundwork for kind of bolder action. He quite quickly said once in post that he would consider unilaterally recognising the state of Palestine, which is actually more than the Labour manifesto promised. So this actually does feel more of a piece with a kind of bolder stance that Lammy is taking. In terms of Rich Hermer, it is really interesting, isn't it? Because Emily Thornberry, I mean, famously made those remarks about, sort of backing up Labour's hawkish position on Israel's operations in Gaza, perhaps in the hopes of demonstrating her loyalty to the Labour leadership and winning and securing her place as future Foreign Secretary. But it sort of didn't matter in the end. And the person that Keir Starmer ended up appointing was, his own public statements on this have actually been quite far to the left of Emily Thornberry's. He was amongst a group of Jewish lawyers, prominent Jewish lawyers, including Adam Wagner and others, that signed an open letter in the Financial Times. This was 10 days after October the 7th, on the 17th of October, saying Israel has a right to defend itself. These are all, I presume, liberal Zionists who would argue this, but that it must uphold international legal principles, international humanitarian law, as it does so. And, these are not radicals. And so I think to suggest, they should have gone further and, this is such a mealy-mouthed letter, fine. But for these people to say that so soon after, an attack by Hamas that many people in the Jewish community were saying was a second Holocaust and, sort of really attempting to catastrophize the attack and to kind of, in order to justify Israel's catastrophic response to it, he was actually a voice of moderation and a voice of reason. I'm not privy to the discussions that have been happening behind the scenes. I do know that the Attorney General has had a say in the kind of conversations that have been going on, and probably will be invited to sort of adjudicate, not formally but informally, on the advice that officials give. So when we get the advice next week, it will probably then kind of bounce to the Attorney General to then sort of give his spin on that advice and what the UK should do. And I think, in a way, what is happening here, and this is very positive, I think, is that Keir Starmer is kind of buying himself, who himself is a practiced barrister, no longer a practicing barrister, but and can see that it's important to sort of wheel out the legitimate voices to justify to people, particularly right-wing critics, I guess, of the government, why what you're doing is justified. And I think having someone like Rich Hermer on their side saying this is not just the moral thing to do, but the legal thing to do, the kind of internationally sanctioned thing to do, will give kind of Keir Starmer and David Lammy bandwidth and permission to go ahead with it without seeming like kind of radical lefties, because God forbid.
US President Joe Biden has addressed the American people in a televised speech explaining his reasons for dropping out of the presidential race. Running at 11 minutes, Biden's address made no mention of the growing fears over his health and competence that have seen him gradually pushed aside. Instead, he opted for a more heroic narrative.
In recent weeks, it's become clear to me that I need to unite my party in this critical endeavor. I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now.
He is noticeably frail. It is always very striking when you go back and watch old speeches made by Joe Biden. Even in 2016, the difference between Joe Biden then and Joe Biden now, although he has maintained his support of Israel to the very bitter end. And do you know what's really fascinating is I'm seeing a lot of conspiracy theories, not even among the MAGA right, but the Democrat left, or the progressives in America, which say that this is all a game of 4D chess, and the president actually planned this to the nth degree, and he's just pretending to lose his mental faculties, and he really outmaneuvered them all. He outmaneuvered the coup, and then he's just walking away after the RNC, being like, "Now, Kamala, we've done a 180." And to that I say, America, you're a very imaginative country. You're a very imaginative country, and that's the nicest way I can put it. Now, that address was filled with nods to Biden's own legacy, with the 81-year-old president highlighting the impact of his economic reforms, also his improvements to healthcare access, and efforts on the climate. It was, he said, a record that merited a second term, which is funny because he did promise to be a one-term president when he started. However, the prophecy he made has come true. The president also wanted to be clear that his record is not over yet, with Biden pledging, at least for the cameras, to continue his legislative agenda.
Over the next 6 months, I'll be focused on doing my job as president. That means I'll continue to lower costs for hardworking families, grow our economy. I'll keep defending our personal freedoms and our civil rights, from the right to vote to the right to choose. I'll keep calling out hate and extremism. Make it clear there is no place in America for political violence or any violence ever, period. I'm going to keep speaking out to protect our kids from gun violence. Our planet from climate crisis is the existential threat. And I will keep fighting for my cancer moonshot so we can end cancer as we know it, because we can do it. I'm going to call for Supreme Court reform because this is critical to our democracy. Supreme Court reform.
So quiet. The Supreme Court reforms are expected to include limits on the terms that justices serve, as well as an enforceable ethics code for those on the bench. It is quite ironic, putting a limit on how long someone can be in a form of politics or in the legal system, when the gerontocracy has actually pushed the Democratic Party into the position that it currently is now. But, people in glass houses, they love throwing stones. Anyway, Biden has long resisted calls to reform the court because he feared its politicization. However, the court has now been politicized, but with a majority of Republican justices after 3 appointments under Trump's presidency. And that, as we know, led to the overturning of the Roe v. Wade abortion ruling and affirmative action judgments, all while granting Donald Trump wider immunity from prosecution. So the horse has kind of bolted on politicization, and now Biden's like, I guess we're going to do it. So Biden, whether he actually has it in him, though, to push through those reforms before the next presidency is an open question. And he now becomes the first incumbent US president to not seek renomination since Lyndon B. Johnson in 1968. And we know that Johnson took over because John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And while no health issue has been publicly confirmed, he is probably the first ever president to sit out an election on grounds of fitness to serve, although there have been others who should have sat them out. Now, Biden's likely successor for the Democratic nomination, Kamala Harris, gave her first campaign speech on Tuesday in Wisconsin.
Before I was elected vice president, before I was elected United States Senator, I was elected Attorney General of the state of California, and I was a courtroom prosecutor before then. And in those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type. promise you, I will proudly put my record against his any day of the week.
Harris has already secured the support of the majority of the Democratic Convention delegates, meaning her nomination for presidential candidate is already likely secured. And that means if she is elected in November, we might see a different approach in one key area compared to her predecessor. Joe Biden's full-throated support of Israel's assault on Gaza has divided Democratic voters and potentially even cost the party votes in November's presidential election. But Kamala Harris appears to be placing some distance between her position on Israel and his. While always towing the US line on Israeli self-defense and Hamas, she has often managed to sound more critical of Israel's conduct than Biden. This is Harris speaking at a meeting with Arab leaders in Dubai in December.
As Israel defends itself, it matters how. The United States is unequivocal. International humanitarian law must be respected. Too many innocent Palestinians have been killed. Frankly, the scale of civilian suffering and the images and videos coming from Gaza are devastating. I have spoken with members of the Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities of America, including those who have lost loved ones in Gaza and American citizens who were injured and evacuated from Gaza. It is truly heartbreaking.
In March, she became the first senior US official to call for an immediate ceasefire.
The Israeli government must do more to significantly increase the flow of aid. No excuses. They must open new border crossings. They must not impose any unnecessary restrictions on the delivery of aid. They must ensure humanitarian personnel, sites, and convoys are not targeted. And they must work to restore basic services and promote order in Gaza so more food, water, and fuel can reach those in need. And given the immense scale of suffering in Gaza, there must be an immediate ceasefire. For at least the next 6 weeks, which is what is currently on the table.
Now, let's not get twisted, because in that speech, Harris also affirmed Israel's right to self-defense and condemned Hamas. But she also did try and foreground the suffering of Palestinians and rebuke Israel for its conduct. She's treading a tightrope. For example, today, she released a statement condemning protesters who were outside Congress last night for supporting Hamas. But she also seemed to try and rebuke Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to Congress last night because Harris opted not to attend, and she wasn't alone in doing so. Around half of the party's congressional representatives also boycotted the speech, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. In their absence, here's how it went.
For all we know, Iran is funding the anti-Israel protests that are going on right now outside this building. Not that many, but they're there, and throughout the city. Well, I have a message for these protesters. When the tyrants of Tehran, who hang gays from cranes and murder women for not covering their hair, are praising, promoting, and funding you, you have officially become Iran's useful idiots. Don't be fooled when the blood libels against the Jewish state come from people who wear fancy silk robes and speak in lofty tones about law and justice. Here's a case in point. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has shamefully accused Israel of deliberately starving the people of Gaza. This is utter, complete nonsense. It's a complete fabrication. Israel has enabled more than 40,000 aid trucks to enter Gaza. That's 500,000 tons of food. And that's more than 3,000 calories for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. If there are Palestinians in Gaza who aren't getting enough food, it's not because Israel is blocking it, it's because Hamas is stealing it. Every civilian death is a tragedy. For Hamas, it's a strategy. They actually want Palestinian civilians to die so that Israel will be smeared in the international media and be pressured to end the war before it's won. This would enable Hamas to survive another day, and as they vowed, to carry out October 7th again and again and again. Well, I want to assure you, no matter what pressure is brought to bear, I will never allow that to happen. As Israel's prime minister, I promise you this: no matter how long it takes, no matter how difficult the road ahead, Israel will not relent. Israel will not bend. We will defend our land. We will defend our people. We will fight until we achieve victory. Victory over liberty, rather victory of liberty over tyranny, victory of life over death, victory of good over evil. That's our solemn commitment.
This, to me, is one of the most disgraceful scenes we've ever seen in modern politics. A genocide heir invited to the most powerful country in the world to be applauded. He had standing ovations for every lie he told about not starving, bombing, and slaughtering a civilian population. When we've seen that footage with our own eyes, we have seen what the IDF is doing in Gaza. We have seen what the IDF and settlers are doing in the West Bank. We have seen the years of oppression, repression, and devastation that has been wrought upon Palestine by Israel. And those standing ovations is the culmination of parallel global projects of misinformation and radicalization. It's the rise of a far right across the world that's managed to ally diagonally along key and perverse lines. And all the while, the liberal establishment has twiddled its thumbs and allowed it to happen, has co-signed it because they're too scared if they say no, then they'll get pushback. Guess what? It happened anyway. Now, there was a lot of applause in that room, but not everyone was clapping. Rashida Tlaib is serving as the representative for Michigan's 12th district, and she is also the only Palestinian American in Congress. She sat in the audience wearing a keffiyeh and holding a sign saying war criminal and guilty of genocide. Now, despite skipping the speech, both Harris and Biden were due to Netanyahu today. As we've been on air, Biden has been in that meeting with Netanyahu in the White House. Tomorrow, the Israeli Prime Minister will meet with the Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago. A nightmare blunt rotation. Rivkah, what did you make of Netanyahu's appearance in Washington? Because do you think a few months ago, so many high-profile Democrats would have boycotted Netanyahu's appearance?
I think that's a very well-phrased question, because I think it's not so much about the numbers. I think only around 70 Democrats actually boycotted the speech, which is about 12 more than there were in 2015. You know, when Netanyahu last spoke to Congress, which was the year after Operation Protective Edge, where about 2,300 Palestinians have been killed. Now we have 39,000 Palestinians killed. You know, if a proportionate number of Congress people had walked out during the speech, proportionate to the amount of Palestinian deaths we've seen, we'd have about 1,000 Congress people walking out. So really the numbers are still quite small, but what's important is who is not there. And I think there's two people that we have to think about here. One is the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. Now, she is obviously a very senior Democrat, but she's also a very outspoken supporter of Israel. She frequently speaks at the AIPAC conferences. She's supported, just a few years ago in 2018, a $38 billion military aid package to Israel, saying it was necessary for Israel's security. The following year in 2019, she supported a motion to effectively ban boycott, divestment and sanctions within many American kind of contexts. And that's obviously legislation we've seen copied and pasted around the world and is, trying now to make its way through the Houses of Parliament in the UK. It's kind of stalling, but almost definitely will be back with a vengeance. So Nancy Pelosi, someone I'm sure has privately been, as Biden, we know, has privately been for many years, attempting to kind of entreat and urge Israel to sort of take a different course. There was a great line that I saw in the LRB that was from 2021, Biden saying to Netanyahu then, look, my dude, we're out of runway, So I think privately, these conversations have been happening for many years with Biden, with Pelosi, but now we're seeing people like her take a public stance against Israel, which is something that kind of everyone can see and is kind of intended to be much more of a break with Netanyahu. I think the other person that we have to also bear in mind is Kamala Harris. You know, it's all well and good for hundreds of Congress people to clap for Netanyahu, but it will ultimately be Kamala Harris, if she becomes president, who will have a huge amount of influence over whether Israel does receive aid from the US. So for her to not be there at a speech, again, it's a bit like Lammy, it's symbolic. You know, her not being there won't have any immediate impact on the amount of aid that Israel receives from the US, but it does send a signal about what the kind of approach is likely to be if she does become president. And that approach, I think, is very interesting. Even in her speech, I think when she was talking about Trump earlier in the segment, when she says, like, I know perpetrators of many kinds, perpetrators, you know, crooks and cheats, and you know, it sort of does beg the question, and war criminals. I suppose, you know, I suppose that speech was kind of. I can't imagine that speech was written without some awareness that is the question, that is the kind of completion of that sentence, as it were. And unlike Biden, who, as Netanyahu does say in his congressional address, has known Bibi for 40 years, the best part of 40 years now, Kamala Harris is of a different generation. She's not got the same sentimental attachments to Israel as Biden does. You know, Biden, I think more than anything, is, you know, he's not just saying it for the sake of the US's kind of diplomatic relations with Israel, but he is an ardent Zionist, which is one of the great claims that Bibi makes at the beginning of his congressional address. It's true. He means it. He is an ardent and quite kind of irrationally committed Zionist, whereas Kamala Harris is less so. You know, we know a lot of other things about her politics and her kind of reactionary tendencies as the kind of, you know, as a prosecutor for the states. But in terms of her, she doesn't have the same fealty to Israel that Biden does. So it will be really interesting to see what happens if she does become president. And to be honest, if Trump becomes president, I also think that there would be a shift, you know, away from Israel, not so much because of Trump's kind of disdain for Israel, so much as his emphasis on domestic politics. It's America first with Trump. So I sort of feel like either option, I mean, not on everything, but in terms of, you know, in relation to Israel, we will probably see a distancing after the next election in America.
It's obviously interesting that Kamala has immediately condemned what she called in the last hour anyone who's associated with the brutal terrorist organization Hamas, and she says it's abhorrent, we must not tolerate it. She condemned the burning of the American flag, which was burned as an effigy of Netanyahu. There was some Hamas's coming graffiti around the train station, but most of that protest was completely peaceful in Washington, but it shows the tightrope that she is walking in America. I think, you know, US leftists are currently tearing their hair out over whether to back Kamala Harris over Trump, but I think the thing we have to remember is it's the lesser of two evils situations, and that's going to come up again and again and again, and that's going to be a debate that's going to be had, I imagine, on this show and elsewhere over the next 4 months. An interesting one indeed, as we see more of Kamala Harris. For my money, dare I say it, I would probably, if I was American, be backing Kamala, but I'm sure I will get flack for that. And luckily I'm not American, so it doesn't matter what I think, just like Charlie XCX. Let's go on to our next story though. And warning, it does contain scenes of graphic violence. Greater Manchester Police is under scrutiny after a video emerged showing an Asian man being kicked in the head by a white officer. The incidents took place on Tuesday evening at Manchester Airport, and it's gone viral for just how shocking it is.
Oh shit! Oh, move back!
For those listening, the video we just played shows an unarmed young man lying restrained on the ground, and a firearms officer is tasering. The officer then kicks the young man in the head with force. He follows this up with a stamp to the head. This wasn't the only violence enacted in this operation. Later, in the same clip, officers kick another unarmed man to the ground and hit him over the head. Officers had been called to the airport after reports of a fight and made 4 arrests. GMP have said that 3 officers were, quote, violently attacked during the encounter, with one reportedly suffering a broken nose. But the force has acknowledged the distressing nature of the violence on display in the video, calling it truly shocking. GMP confirmed today that a firearms officer has been suspended from all duties and a referral has been made to the Independent Office for Police Conduct. Analysis of the incident is already pointing to racism as a potential factor. Speaking to Radio 4, this was former Met Police Chief Superintendent Dal Babu.
Here we have a unit of white officers in specialist departments, and you have a group of Asian people. And the force used against them has been totally excessive.
So are you concerned about racial?
I think racism played a significant part in this. And I think what's quite worrying around this is how Greater Manchester Police have then put forward a Asian officer, senior Asian officer. It's not the Chief Constable, it's not Steve Watson, it's an Asian officer. You can count on one hand the number of senior Asian officers in Greater Manchester Police. I think there is a little bit of a cynical attempt to put forward an Asian officer to try and say, look, we're dealing with this. But this incident is now over 48 hours. And I think Greater Manchester Police have been slow out the blocks in understanding the seriousness of this. I received copies of this video from numerous sources because people were incredibly concerned about what happened. So this is a very, very serious incident. And at a time when trust in the police is so low, this is another example of an incident where people will be further concerned about this. So, you know, in the old days, it used to be minorities, it used to be LGBTQ people, it used to be young people. But now, I think no matter where you go, more and more people have less confidence in the police. So I should imagine the Home Office will be very interested. The chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee has asked for information on this. So this is a really significant incident that really needs to be dealt with effectively. And I'm not sure that Greater Manchester Police has the skills necessarily to manage working with the communities to try and reduce the tension.
This is by no means the first time GMP have been accused of racism during their operations. Just 2 days ago, it emerged 7 officers were under investigation, 5 of them suspended from duty after claims of racial discrimination. And in 2022, I personally worked on a story for Novara Media that revealed Greater Manchester Police were 8 times more likely to ban young black people from attending the city's annual Caribbean Carnival on vague suspicion of being associated with gangs. This was despite the fact that white individuals were far more highly associated with gang violence in Manchester. In 2023, after we ran that story about it being potentially unlawful, GMP confirmed they were dropping that policy. Now, local politicians have condemned the incident at Manchester Airport, but also urged patience. Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham said the situation wasn't, quote, clear-cut, and urged people to avoid politicising it. He said this. People do use situations like this for political purposes. I would ask them not to do it. There's understandable feeling and anger in the communities when people see the incident. Of course, I guess everyone understands that, and there's a reaction. But when people seek to exploit that, then I don't think that is the public interest. It's not right. He went on to say this. I guarantee everybody across Greater Manchester today who has deep concerns about this that this will be done properly in the right way, independently. It will be looked at and will come to a right and fair conclusion. We have to balance the range of things, don't we? This is a difficult job that our frontline professionals have to do, but at the same time, they have to always uphold the highest standards, and that is what I'm here to do, to hold Greater Manchester Police to account on behalf of the public, and that is the process that will now take place. Lots to be said there. One person who has no such qualms about further politicising what, it has to be said, is a political incident. I'm sorry, the police are not a neutral force, is Ashfield MP Lee Anderson. Here's what Anderson told the BBC about a man being kicked in the head by armed police.
The message I'm getting loud and clear from my constituents is that they are fed up with seeing police dancing around rainbows and being nice to people and running off from rioters. They want the police to do their job. And I think these police yesterday should be commended. In fact, I'd give them a medal.
Lee Anderson's constituents are, of course, in Nottinghamshire, about 53 miles away from Greater Manchester, so it doesn't really matter what they think or what medals they want to give the police in Greater Manchester. Rivkah, lots of local politicians are urging patience until the full story emerges, but is there ever a time when the sort of violent response we've seen in that video is proportionate from police?
I think this kind of response that we all need to chill out and wait for the full story to emerge is unfortunately a tactic of kind of buying time and allowing kind of outrage, justified outrage, to die down. So that when eventually in a year's time we get an answer about what actually happened, the story will have moved on. Greater Manchester Police's statement, as is very typical with police statements, has changed rapidly over the time since the story was first broken. First, it was, these people were a clear danger to firearms officers. They could have stolen their guns or their tasers. And then we had the admission that it was shocking and highly unusual. I think we only have to look at Greater Manchester Police's record to know that it is not remotely unusual, and in fact very closely resembles the 2016 tasering of the black former Aston Villa footballer Dalian Atkinson, who was not only tasered to death, but kicked in the head so badly that bootlace prints were left on his forehead. I hate to be so graphic about this, but I actually think that these kinds of graphic video sort of images that we're seeing are a key, sort of citizen journalistic tool for holding the police to account, because all of us can just see how deeply brutal and unnecessary it is to kick someone in the head who's already got a live taser on them. Someone who's being tasered is in no position to seize an officer's gun, is in no position to do anything, frankly. I mean, I've never been tasered, but I imagine it's pretty debilitating. And so, we can all see for ourselves, and we don't need any additional glossing, investigation, explanation about why what that officer did was justified. It just plainly isn't. Nothing that person could have done justifies how the police subsequently treated him. I think what we're seeing here, I would go as far as to draw a direct link between the way that the Greater Manchester Police have acted just there and the demonization of Muslims, of brown people, of anyone who looks vaguely Arab or pro-Palestine by mainstream MPs like the now Home Secretary Yvette Cooper, who just before the general election was talking about violent scenes in pro-Palestine areas like Greater Manchester. So I really think that the way that pro-Palestine people, particularly people of color who kind of are just coded somehow as pro-Palestine simply for being brown, are now have been sort of narrated by our politicians who get shouted at on a loudhailer once and sort of cry violence, are being coded as aggressive, as violent, and that is filtering down into the actions of police officers who are sort of feel licensed to respond to people of color, brown people in airports as if they were about to attack them, because that's what all the mainstream politicians are saying that they're all about to do, sort of at will. And this is obviously goes directly into Netanyahu's Congress address. He talks about how this is not a clash of civilizations. This is barbarism versus civilization. And this is exactly, there is a direct link between that rhetoric, the rhetoric of people like Yvette Cooper saying that there are, people who are simply advocating for the rights of Palestinians are violent, are aggressive, are barbaric, and then the way that people are treated in airports for reasons that we don't know, but we don't have to know.
There's obviously specifics within the Greater Manchester area, and I will say that there is a current wave of political mobilisation that I think the white establishment is afraid of and worried about. I think that is very highly tied to mobilisation around Palestine, but there's wider mobilisation within South Asian communities that the white establishment has demonised in the manner that you're talking about, specifically with Palestine. But it's spread, and you are seeing an even more brutal response to individuals within the Greater Manchester area as well. And hopefully we'll cover that in more depth, because it's really interesting what's going on there. And there's worries on all sides about where people's political energies are being harnessed. But Lee Anderson certainly is not one intervention that anyone in Greater Manchester particularly cares about. Wales is getting another new First Minister. Eluned Morgan is set to become the first ever woman to lead the country. She's a Labour peer who served in the Senedd since 2016 and is currently Health Minister in the Welsh Government. Her bid for leader of Welsh Labour was uncontested and came after the resignation of Vaughan Gething. Now, he happened to be the first black man to lead any British nation, a lot of firsts for Wales. Unfortunately, Gething's tenure was over almost as soon as it began, after he was hit with allegations of corruption. Gething lost a no confidence vote in early June, but he didn't step down right away. He finally threw in the towel on the 16th of July, still denying any wrongdoing. Now, Morgan is not yet officially Wales's First Minister, as the Senedd is on recess, but once it has been recalled on the 6th of August, Morgan almost certainly will take up the position. I'm joined now by Hugh Williams, a Cardiff-based political philosopher, writing regularly on Welsh politics and co-editor of the collection The Welsh Way. Hugh, I want to start by saying, what is Eluned Morgan's political background?
Well, we can say for certain that she's very experienced. She has been a politician since the age of 27, when she was elected to the European Parliament back in the late 90s. And after her time in European Parliament, then came over to the Senedd in Cardiff. So we're looking at over a quarter of a century in politics from a fairly young age. So she is a very experienced operator, and in that regard, I suppose somebody that Welsh Labour are perhaps looking at, and potentially also Keir Starmer in Westminster, and thinking that this is a safe pair of hands, somebody who should be able to navigate some of the choppy waters that have emerged over the past few months in Wales. And I think there's a sense perhaps that she's somebody who can perform well in front of the camera, as a solid, a decent campaigner, and somebody also obviously who's been in the party long enough and knows enough people in the various sort of cliques to be able to perhaps find that unity that was so difficult for Vaughan Gething, her predecessor, to establish.
Yeah, let's pick up on that for a second, because obviously Eluned Morgan did back Vaughan Gething in the leadership election that took him to power, but she was uncontested when she put herself forward for Welsh Labour leader. Is she truly a unity candidate?
In terms of her background, in terms of how she's perceived, perhaps on the left and right, she's maybe seen as somebody who's more to the middle ground than Vaughan Gething. I think also what I've just mentioned in terms of her background, her experience, the manner in which I suppose she hasn't necessarily created enemies for herself over time. That's an important element, I suppose, of being a leader of Welsh Labour. You know, a group of politicians who have been together and been established for a very long time. I suppose we shouldn't perhaps either discount the fact that she's a Welsh speaker, and so that will be important in terms of some factions, and also in terms of the perception of her as First Minister. Although she was born up in Cardiff, she was brought up in a family that had roots very much in West Wales, in Pembrokeshire, and in that sense, perhaps she might be seen as somebody who has political horizons that go past the capital of Wales. Although she was from or brought up in West Cardiff, she has perhaps those links and that understanding, I suppose, of life in communities beyond Cardiff itself. So yeah, I think in many ways it's easy enough, we could put it, for Eluned Morgan and her supporters to create this narrative of her as a sort of unity candidate.
What's the current political landscape that Eluned Morgan will be taking on in Wales? Because in the general election, obviously, Welsh Labour triumphed, but their vote share dropped. And the third biggest party was Reform, almost equaling the Conservatives for vote share. That is a challenge that Eluned Morgan and Welsh Labour are going to face. How are they planning to tackle that?
Yeah, you're right that that's obviously a very big concern for Labour, but I suppose for the political establishment, and one might potentially add society more generally, that reform seem to have already got a firm foothold in Wales on the basis of very little other than, that election campaign. There is, I suppose, in some sense, a precedent because we had 7 members of UKIP in the Senedd back in 2016 on account of the PR system that we have here in Wales, which is about to be reformed and is going to become a more, if you like, pure form of PR, so that we won't have candidates who are standing in their seats combined with a PR list. It's moving to a system where it's going to be members elected purely on a PR basis. So, and that in itself actually obviously creates more of an issue, I suppose, in terms of the potential for reform to gain seats. There are also going to be closed lists, which is very controversial. There's been a lot of criticism around that in Wales because people perceive it as being anti-democratic. The one is voting for only a party and that there are no names next to those parties on your electoral, on your voting slip. And so, combined with obviously the sort of material issues that are facing many people across so many of Wales's communities, the frustration, the lack, if you like, of representation, the alienation from politics, and also, of course, the rather unpopular politics of Keir Starmer, it means that Labour have to take this threat very seriously. But I would suggest that at the moment, that beyond perhaps recognising that threat, there hasn't really been much debate or discussion, and that's a huge issue and one that we'll have to, look at keenly, I think, because over time, whether or not Labour are going to be able to create a narrative, a form of politics in Wales that actually represents a credible, if you like, opposition to the neo-fascist reform agenda is something that is, put it like this way, on the basis of how Labour responded to UKIP in 2016, I wouldn't have a great amount of confidence that they've actually have any sort of winning recipe for that, for that form of opposition. I think one of the things that we need to recognise here as well is that, to a large extent, what Welsh Labour are able to do in that context depends, of course, on what happens down in Westminster. And the Senate elections are not that far around the corner to 2026, isn't it? And in that time, it's unlikely, I think, the form of politics that Starmer at the moment is practicing is going to have any real impact on the everyday lives of people here in Wales.
Kamala Harris's path to the presidency isn't going to be an easy one. She's joining the race late in the day. Her opponent is a former president and a notorious misogynist with a gift for whipping up support. Unfortunately, Donald Trump is one of the funniest, intentionally, unintentionally, I don't know, people we've ever seen on the presidential stage. But if a presidential campaign is a culture war, then Harris might already have won the battle of the memes.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you.
I'm just living that life.
Now, for those of you who don't know, it's Brat Summer. I'm so sorry, Charlie. That's a remix made by someone on Twitter of Charlie XCX's song Von Dutch from her new album Brat. And I want to be specific. That's actually the remix of the remix. That is the Von Dutch remix that Charlie released with Addison Rae. But this remix was soon followed by an endorsement from Charlie XCX herself, who said, Kamala is Brat. I'm an angel, so I'm not going to get into Charlie XCX's team, but I can tell you for sure it was her American creative director who tweeted that. Now, it didn't take long for Harris's campaign to grab the cultural moment. Her campaign Twitter HQ page changed its backdrop using the Brat album's rave culture-inspired bright lime green colour and low-res fonts to announce Kamala HQ. Since then, the celebratory memes have kept on flooding Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram.
Well, what we really need is a feminine nominee. A what? A feminine nominee. Hit it like rum, pom, pom, pom.
You exist in the context.
666 with a princess streak. I'm everywhere, I'm so Julia.
Both those songs are from Charlie XCX and Chapel Roan, who are the two pop girls of the summer. I just need you to know this. This is a Venn diagram of my interest, which is pop music, politics, and it's very rare I get to marry the two. Now, memes do not win elections, but a young generation just might. The enthusiasm with which Gen Z has met Kamala Harris's likely nomination indicates an uptick in interest in November's election from younger people. And there's a hell of a lot of them, with 41 million American members of Generation Z eligible to vote this year. A Biden-Trump rematch wasn't an event many of them were excited by, but the chance to vote for the US's first female president, who's also a woman of colour, and who isn't weighed down by the legacy of a political family or a history of hawkish foreign interventions, and her hair is always laid. Well, to Gen Z, that could feel genuinely exciting, and it seems to show in early polling. Axis was the first to run the numbers, and in a survey conducted on the 21st of July after Biden stood down, they found Harris has a 20% lead over Donald Trump among 18 to 34-year-olds. The same demographic only gave Biden a 6-point lead over Trump. Rivkah, I mentioned this earlier, but I'm saying all these things about Harris and how she might be perceived. What's happening in the US is leftists, I seem to be taking the position of a lesser evil and getting behind Harris the way they didn't with Biden. What's your view on that? And also Harris in general?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Moya, I feel like we should talk about the fact that you are almost definitely going to play a version, one of the Kamala Harris remixes, if God's plan, if God's plan comes true at your club night on Friday. I feel like we should be cross-pollinating the plugin.
I've taken a request for this, and I'm not going to play that remix. I promised someone asked me if I'd play it, and I'm not going to play the remix. Yet.
Okay, okay, fine. We're gonna have to publish a news article on that, Moya. I'm afraid. Moya Lothian-McLean denies that she will play the remix of the Von Dutch remix at Heated on Friday, but still can't. But anyway, so no, I think it's first of all, Charlie XX didn't endorse Kamala. I'm just gonna say it. It was a joke. Like, we should just see it as that. Like, and also, Brat, like the persona of that album is not some like laudable figure. She's a mess. She is like confused about what she wants with her life. She's having beef with all her friends. She's like taking loads of drugs. I mean, in that, probably Charlie XCX and Kamala Harris do have some commonality. But honestly, I even if it was like a joke that had some truth to it, I think it was like more than just an endorsement. It was like, this woman's got a lot going on. What I really found funny is that Doug Emhoff had Jewish husband, Kamala's Jewish husband, his daughter from a previous relationship or child, I think they might be non-binary, Ella Emhoff, posted the Charlie XCX quote unquote endorsement on their Instagram story, being like, Charlie XCX knows what's up, with the Apple. With the bit from the Apple song. Sorry, now we're getting into quite a deep cut, but you have to listen to that album. The song Apple, that's like, the apple's rotten right to the core. Like, I sort of feel like maybe there's just a sense in which they're not just supporting her, but there's a kind of ironic distancing. And I do think that's probably an apt way of describing a lot of the left's sort of approach to Kamala. I think I saw someone saying, we get 24 hours after Biden pulls out to sort of joke about how she's she's the nation's wacky aunt, before we have to remember that she's sort of like an evil person, which is like a quote from another tweet. I'm way too online. But anyway, I think there is a sense amongst leftists that we can kind of joke about it. But also, when the serious business of like Trump versus Kamala, it comes to it, then we should support Kamala. 2020 was a completely different race. No one liked Biden on the left because there was Bernie, because there was Elizabeth Warren, if you're a bit more like what. But, and Biden was, his popularity kind of tracked directly the sort of age brackets. And younger people just were way more supportive of Sanders. Whereas now it's a 2-horse race. Like, in many states, there weren't even primaries. She's kind of been parachuted into this kind of candidacy in a way that Biden just wasn't. So it's kind of, there's not really a comparison to be made. But I also think that, you've got all the kind of like right-wing gays, the Pete Buttigieg's and his like crew. But like, actually, I think a lot of people on the left who are sort of quote unquote endorsing Kamala are doing so in quite a pragmatic way. There was a similar campaign in 2020 actually that was called Settle for Biden. The Instagram account was fantastic, sadly no longer exists. And so I do think there is a history of a kind of reluctant leftist support for the kind of inevitably, lesser of two evils, I suppose. And I think that's basically what we're seeing here. I think we need to let Charlie XCX off the hook. Long story short.
Charlie XCX, you can tell when she has access to her Twitter, and I won't say how you know, but I don't think she tweeted that because I don't think she really cares about what's going on in the US election that much. She's busy. She's everywhere. She's so Julia. Thank you so much, Rivkah, for joining me tonight. And thank you for your report.
Yeah, no worries. Hopefully I'll be proven right. Hopefully the sources that spoke to me are correct. I mean, I think basically what I said is true. If it doesn't go the way we want, that is because of Starmer. So yeah, you have your answer.
And we will find out tomorrow whether the UK is dropping those objections against the ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. Also, come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you have been watching Novara Media. The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree, and the coconut also falls from the tree. Good night.